Chitubox has recently released their own brand of resin called Conjure, and they sent me a few bottles to test out. In this video, I'm going to be using the Rigid and Tough. Are they any good? Let's find out. Before we start this review, there's something I want to talk about, and that's skin color. Conjure offers 4 colors of their resins: black, white, gray, and skin, and this is a problem because their skin color doesn't look like my skin, and it also doesn't look like the skin of a lot of other people. The 3D printing manufacturer Elegoo used to offer a resin color that they called skin, and they've since changed the name to beige. In fact, they actually sent me a bottle where a beige sticker had been placed over the word skin, and I think this is a really great decision. It's more descriptive, accurate, and most importantly, it's inclusive. Given that there's so many colors to pick from, I would love to see companies like Conjure follow the lead of Elegoo and Anycubic and start using descriptive color terms in their resin names. This is an easy way to make this industry more inclusive, and as a benefit to all the makers out there, you'll have a better idea of what color your resin is going to be when you buy it. Okay, so on to the review. Conjure resin ships in an aluminum bottle, which is really sturdy. It feels like you could run over this thing with a tank. It also has a child-proof cap, which, I'll be honest, it was almost Andrew-proof. This thing is really hard to get open, and there is zero chance this is going to accidentally open during shipping. So if that's a concern of yours, don't worry, Conjure has you covered. For the first part of this review, I'll be using the Conjure Rigid resin, which is a general use prototyping resin, and for the second half, I'll be using the Conjure Tough, which is meant to have a little bit more flexibility. In this video, I'm going to be using the Elegoo Mars 3 Resin 3D printer. The Mars 3 has a mono 4K LCD screen, so it offers a good combination of high resolution and fast print speeds. It's also a printer I have a lot of experience with, so I can focus on the resin and not have to worry about the machine. Conjure has published recommended profiles for all their resins, and one of the first things I noticed about the Rigid resin was that it had a per layer exposure time of 4.5 to 5 seconds. That's really high for a mono LCD screen. Typically you're looking at about 2.5 seconds. I loaded up Chitubox and created a profile for this resin using their recommended settings. The 4.5 second per layer exposure time seems on the high end for a mono screen printer, but all the rest of the settings look okay. It's worth taking a look at this model from Loot Studios. You can see that there are these clusters of fine support structures. Typically, if a model is over-cured, these will all bunch together and they can be very difficult to remove. That's really my only concern for this model, so once that's taken care of, it's time to send it to the printer. But first, a quick note from today's sponsor. It's me. Well, it's ResinLapse. ResinLapse is the easiest way to create a time-lapse of your resin 3D prints using only a ResinLapse cable and your DSLR camera. We listened to your feedback and you requested a Nikon cable, so we made it. You can check out a link in the description below to see both the Canon and Nikon versions of ResinLapse, which let you take photos at each layer of your resin print and combine them together to make a smooth time-lapse. Okay, back to the video. After the model finished printing, I took a look at it and noticed the detail looked pretty good. So just taking a look at the model, there's no obvious failures, the support hasn't detached from the model in any areas, and some of the fine detail, like this little insignia on this pauldron, it's pretty visible. So the detail is there, and the only thing that I noticed that's kind of a negative is the support material was absolutely just welded on, so it was really hard to break this off. It definitely felt overexposed, so that exposure time that they recommend was a little bit high. Conjure recommends a 30 to 60 second cure time, and just to play it safe in case there was any resin on the surface of the model that was in a hard to reach spot, I let it cure for the entire 60 seconds. And overall, it looked pretty good. With the 4.5 second exposure time per layer, the biggest issue I had was that the support material left a lot of marks on the model when it was removed, so there's a lot of nubs, a lot of defects, and a lot of little imperfections. Because the overall quality of the model still looked pretty good, I went back to Chitubox and dropped the exposure time from 4.5 to 2.5 seconds, and that was the only change I made to the profile. Because the model looked okay, I didn't see a reason to adjust the retract or lift speeds, so I decided to focus only on the exposure time. And I was pleasantly surprised. After the model printed out, the support material was much easier to remove, and this time it just broke away as it should. This is definitely more in line with what I would expect from a standard rigid photopolymer resin. Once the support material was removed and the model had been washed and cured, I took a look at it, and it's really hard to tell if it's any different. The actual quality of the model still looks sharp, so all the fine details are visible, and the support nubs are definitely more muted, so there's less holes and less pockmarks, but generally speaking, it's kind of difficult to tell a difference between the 4.5 and the 2.5 second exposure, so I don't see a compelling reason to go with such a high exposure time, especially 4.5 seconds on a mono LCD. It just seems a lot higher than it should be. If you're going to be printing with the Conjure Rigid resin, I would definitely recommend experimenting with lowering the exposure time. In this particular instance, I was able to lower the exposure time by 2 full seconds and still get a crisp, clean looking model. So now let's take a look at the Conjure Tough resin. Tough resin is typically associated with the term mechanical toughness, which refers to the ability of a material to deform without fracturing. So it's a little strange that in their marketing photos, the resin looks like a rubber, and in fact, on their spec sheet, it even specifically calls out that the material has physical properties similar to rubber. Mechanical toughness is typically associated with materials like ABS or nylon that have a degree of flexibility to them, so they're not brittle. They are used for things like living hinges or assemblies that require some degree of malleability. The Conjure Tough resin is definitely thicker than the Conjure Rigid resin, and I noticed that when I was filling the vat. The parts that printed out were 100% in line with what I would expect from a tough resin, which is good. The material itself is actually mechanically tough, so it does have some degree of flexibility. And you can see here's a direct comparison of the tough material and the rigid material. And with the tough material, these turrets they're flexible, so you can move them around. They don't feel like they're gonna snap. It feels like they're gonna, return to their original position after being moved. Whereas with the rigid resin, it feels like there's a lot more resistance when bending these parts, and they feel a lot more brittle, so you can sort of tell that they're about to snap off here. They're at the very edge of their travel. To challenge the Conjure Tough resin, I'm printing out this cargo droid from Loot Studios. It's got a lot of fine detail and a lot of thin features, so it's kind of an ideal model for printing out with a tough resin. I made a few changes to the recommended settings. First, I lowered the exposure time from 5 seconds down to 3, and I also reduced the retraction speed by half. Because the material is more viscous, I wanted to give it time to flow back under the platform after the initial lift. This model requires a lot of support material, and you can see a lot of these thin and fine features are supported by long, tall columns of support. So this is a pretty good challenge to determine if the Conjure Tough resin can handle printing out these features. And it did great. Here's the model after an initial rinse, and the support structures all worked great. For me, the real test is these small, fine structures. Typically they delaminate when you are printing a wide cross section, but here they held on just fine. After removing the support structures and curing the model, I was really impressed with the level of detail. So going through, you can see all the detail from the original CAD model is present in the printed part, and overall it's just a pretty good looking model. Testing out the mechanical toughness shows that things like the exhaust are still flexible, so they're malleable enough to be able to get moved around. I'm not worried about breaking them off, or I wouldn't be worried about dropping this part. But it's not what I would consider to be really elastomeric or rubber-like. It doesn't really fold over on itself. Here you can see even the legs, they're flexible, so they move, they don't snap, but I wouldn't be able to bend it back over its head. Overall, I really like the Conjure Tough resin, but I'm a little worried some people might buy it thinking it's a rubber-like resin. If you're looking for a resin that has some degree of flexibility, then the Tough is a pretty good choice. I wanted to make a point to thank everybody who's used my coffee recently. It really helps to keep the channel going, and it's also just a lot of fun for me to see all the messages from everyone. If you're interested in donating to the channel, I don't have a Patreon because my videos are kind of sporadic, but you can feel free to buy me a coffee using the link in the description. I've also added links in the description to the Conjure resin, as well as all the models used in this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching, and have fun printing.